Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to ICRIER. Before we start and I make my short opening comments, may I request Sejal to welcome our chief guest, Mr. Ashok Lavasa, Secretary to the Government of India. Mr. Ashok Lavasa, Finance Secretary and Secretary Expenditure, Ministry of Finance, Government of India. Distinguished speakers who are going to speak in the technical session to follow, Gireesh, Greg, and our team from ICRIER and CPI that have been involved in preparing this report, and of course, distinguished guests. On behalf of ICRIER, Climate Policy Initiative, and Stockholm Environmental Institute, it is a delight to welcome all of you to the launch of our report, Scaling Up Rooftop Solar Power in India, the Potential of Municipal Solar Bonds. The report has been prepared by ICRIER, CPI, and SEI, and funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. And at the background is the new climate economy, under which ICRIER has been doing a lot of work in the past few years, and they have also supported this study intellectually. And several individuals have been part of this study, and I must say it's been an incredible journey of learning and scholarship and occasional pain, as you would expect for data collection, especially in India. And we've looked at 2 municipalities, Surat and IndiaMs, and the technical team is going to talk to you about. But I think the pain has been worth it in the form of a gain of a highly data-intensive study that, with respect to solar rooftop potential, and the viability of raising resources through this means. And the study, of course, has wider applicability to municipal bonds in general. As you know, the quantum of capital required for infrastructure in Indian studies is huge. Many of you will recall the high-powered expert committee on urbanization that estimated the financing costs of infrastructure, and that was over a 20-year period that aggregated to 39.2 lakh crores. And it did not include investments in energy. And add to this the other costs of kind of business as usual urbanization, add to this the costs of unplanned development and climate change, all those externalities that we talk about. And you recognize that we have to begin to look at alternative means of financing urban infrastructure. But there is good news. And the good news is that there is recognition that India's economic future is linked inextricably to its cities, not to the detriment or not to ignoring rural infrastructure and rural irrigation, but our economic prosperity and our economic development is linked to our cities, because cities will contribute a major component of our GDP, they will contribute to taxes, and they will contribute to what I think will be the most important economic agenda in India in the near future, which is jobs. Jobs will come from cities, and cities will hold, as the numbers show you, 600 million people by 2030. And in part, this will be an organic growth within the cities, and in part, I think there's going to be a lot of migration from rural areas to urban areas in search of economic opportunities. And those economic opportunities will fundamentally depend upon the ability of citizens to be able to get access to quality public services. And if cities are to become the real engines of economic growth, they have to be empowered and to be made accountable. And that's what we are going to talk about in the technical session. Managing the transition to urbanization will need multiple interventions, including investment, capacity building, as well as a framework for governance. And I'm going to spare you the details, but the traditional financing model of infrastructure in India in cities has been really public sector led and through intergovernmental transfers from center to the state and state to the urban local bodies. The constitutional amendment gave municipalities the power of the third tier of government, although the funding mandate was not explicitly provided for. At the same time, ULBs have found it difficult to raise resources on their own. I recommend this chapter in the economic survey of 2016-17 that talks about ULBs and their ability to raise property taxes and what has been the deficiencies or constraints for ULB to actually raise taxes. The potential is there, but they have been constrained to raise that revenue. And the numbers show that own revenues of Indian local governments are only 0.5% of GDP in 2007-8, while intergovernment transfers were 0.4% of GDP. So with regard to transfers, state finance commissions have to be set up. They give their recommendations. Sometimes the recommendations have been implemented. More often than not, those recommendations have not been implemented. In this background, it is inevitable for cities and municipalities to look at innovative means of finance to fund the large gaps of their investment needs. There is evidence also to suggest that financing comes easier because there is a strong correlation between the financial strength of the ULB, its governance, and its ability to raise finance. And so both resource and capacity are important in ULBs. Empowering cities, therefore, to raise revenue, fortifying them with functional independence in decision-making, and helping build capacity, the broad macro recommendations that you will see will emerge from the study. Municipal bonds can become a game changer, of course, and you will see that in this scenario. And 2 days ago, the Pune Municipal Corporation was able to raise about 200 crores worth of bonds. So there is hope, there is potential. We need to do a lot of things. There are challenges, but I think we've made a beginning. And rooftop solar is increasingly becoming cost effective. And that's really very good news and hearty news. And third-party financing, which we will discuss in the technical session, is probably a bottom-up model that could potentially work. ICRIER is proud, really proud, to be associated with very quality institutions like SEI, CPI, and of course the NCE to contribute to the evidence basis for India's policy making and to contribute to India's major urban challenges. This report comes on the heels of another report that we released last year, which talked about using nightlights data and also talked about the business as usual costs of urbanization in 4 Indian cities, Surat, Indore, Bangalore, and Pune. And we promise to continue to push the boundaries of research in this area and to collaborate with like-minded institutions. And of course, the government in this effort to help achieve our dream of cities that are sustainable, inclusive, and of course, livable as well. Without taking too much of your time, I must say that we are deeply indebted to Mr. Ashok Lavasa, Secretary Government of India, to have readily and kindly consented to grace the occasion and deliver the chief guest address. Mr. Ashok Lavasa, please. Thank you all very much for coming.
Good morning, everybody. Dr. Rajat, Kathuria, Gregor, and Mr. Shrimali, and friends. It's a very happy coincidence today that the northern part of India and India as a whole, today being the 21st June, perhaps is the longest day in the year. So you have maximum sun in spite of today being a little cloudy. And the other interesting part is that today also happens to be the International Yoga Day. Now, why am I saying this? Because I was reminded of the person who flew the first solar power plane around the world. I think it was called Impulse. And one of the longest stints that he did, the longest stretch, was probably 8 days when he was in the flight all by himself. As you might know that it's a single person aircraft. And when after 8 days of flying, continuous flying, he landed, so he was asked that how did he sustain himself? And he said, I sustained myself, A, because of solar energy, and B, because of yoga, which gave me spiritual energy. So it's a happy coincidence today that the two coordinates have met. And the other interesting part is that what Dr. Rajat Kathuria talked about, the Pune Municipal Corporation raising its bond, and tomorrow is the day when they are getting themselves listed on the stock exchange. So a combination of various circumstances have, in a way, colluded to give greater relevance to the session that we are having today. It is also a little ironical that sun, which is the primary source of energy, is receiving attention after centuries of neglect, in which we exploited all kinds of sources, caused a lot of calculable and incalculable havoc, reached a situation where globally we confer to rue the consequences of what we have done and try to find ways to mitigate the problem for which we are primarily responsible. Solar energy, I think, provides a lot of answers to the current day problems. I am reminded of October 2015, when India declared its intended nationally determined contribution. Now they are no longer intended, they are nationally determined contribution. And whatever be the current turbulence which is being faced by the climate change agreement, Paris Agreement, I'm sure that all the right-minded people in the world would understand the gravity of the situation and try and address the problems of climate change. As India has been consistently saying, that climate change is not about addressing the problems of environment alone. It is actually connected to the whole business of development. Because whatever we face today are the consequences of the kind of technologies and the path of development which was followed for maybe 150, 200 years. And without blaming anybody for whatever has happened, the plain realization now is that it was on account of the kind of technologies that we followed and the exploitation, indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources, that human beings realized that they have damaged the environment and perhaps also put at peril the future of our progenies. The fact that a good part of the world has developed and the better part of the world has not yet developed raises a question that development and the process of growth, betterment of the quality of life is inevitable. So nobody can make a case to let people who are poor or deprived or living below a decent level of standard of living, nobody can say that they don't have the right to develop. So if development is inevitable, then we must find ways in which we can minimize the adverse consequences of that path of growth. And we all know that energy is one of the most important ingredients of the modern systems of development. Solar energy has now found a lot of acceptance, and there is a greater need to make it available and usable by people at large. You all know the kind of targets which India has set for itself. 1 lakh megawatts, 100 gigawatts is solar out of the 175 gigawatts that India wants to, capacity that India wants to install as far as renewable energy is concerned. And we find that this journey of installing solar capacity has grown enormously. However, there are certain issues about solar energy or renewable energy in general which are important to be addressed. If you look at the three principles of the policy of power development in India, you would find that all the growth of power sector, it has hinged on three principles. And these three principles are A, availability, B, accessibility, and C, affordability. So now you find that in the last 2 decades, there is enormous growth as far as installed capacity is concerned, substantially from conventional sources, but a great deal from non-conventional sources. In 1992, when the process of economic liberalization started, I think renewable energy did not even exist in the scheme of things. So while there has been a lot of multiplication in the capacity, thermal capacity, gas-based capacity, a little bit in hydel capacity, smaller in nuclear capacity, but thermal capacity has grown enormously, and simultaneously renewable energy sources have also grown. However, when you look at the two other pillars of accessibility and affordability, I think that is where the challenges lie. So if you want to have renewable energy carried through your grid all across the country, then there are technological issues which balancing the grid, the stability of the grid, those issues are well known. So I'm not going into those issues. But that is an issue which needs to be addressed, which we have tried to address by having that green corridor development, which is going on both intrastate as well as interstate. And the fact that there is a lot more irradiance and solar capacity in some far-flung areas of Rajasthan, or a lot of wind capacity in the coastal region, increases the challenge of carrying this electricity to other parts. But government has very systematically created market mechanisms. Some of them have worked very well. Some of them are yet to establish themselves. But the renewable purchase obligation is one big effort in boosting the utilization of the capacity that has been created. Considering that there are a lot of challenges, I think many more things are yet to be done, and which different governments are addressing. Then you had the system of regulators announcing tariff for wind, solar, etc., so that the entire marketplace becomes a little more regulated. And you have also witnessed in the last 3-4 years how the tariffs have dropped enormously. But the area of rooftops, I think, is yet to catch on in a big way, which is the central theme of this report. And considering the fact that the urbanization process in India is still at a very primary stage, I would say. If you go back to the report of Ishaja Jailuwalia, where she spoke of almost 60% urbanization, and saying that almost 70% of the commercial buildings which will exist in India in 2040, they are yet to be constructed. So we are looking at a huge expansion of rooftops in the country. And if we are able to integrate the installation of rooftop capacity, solar capacities, I think it will make life that much more easier. But also, when you fly, for example, over Delhi, you find that there are lakhs of millions of houses in Delhi, and their rooftops can be utilized, for which government has introduced several schemes, and it is catching up in a big way. Mr. Saxena was telling me about almost 10 megawatts of capacity having been created in Delhi. You have very close to where we are sitting, Habitat Center has a rooftop. The Environment Ministry has a 1 megawatt rooftop sitting on it, and it's a building which is energy neutral in that sense because it produces more electricity than what it consumes. So this is something which is catching on. We had the Kochi airport 2 years ago, 12 megawatts, the first fully solar powered airport in the world. The possibilities are enormous. Go to the railway stations, the cricket stadia, the sports stadia. In fact, Prime Minister has particularly emphasized that if we utilize the roofs of all the stadiums in the country, it gives you a lot of space, and it comes virtually free. Similarly, the platforms, railway platforms. So the point is that with the proliferation of solar capacity, there is going to be a premium on land as well. And if you need so many hectares per megawatt, then is it easy to find that kind of land? Is it affordable for an investor to invest in the cost of land or even leasing of land and continue to make it a viable business? Although I must say that government with its schemes of solar parks and many state governments have come up with the leasing model where the capital cost of land gets absorbed in an affordable way, and you find that the tariffs have come down enormously. So as far as the affordability part, I think increasingly people are finding that perhaps the day is not far when solar energy becomes cheaper than coal. In fact, in some cases, you might find that it is already appearing to be cheaper. But the other thing about solar energy is the reliability factor, which is what I think we need to work on. And the storage technology, if it develops in an affordable manner, I think that is what is going to provide the key to decentralized solar distribution. The number of villages in India, although we have a electrification program and we hope to complete electrifying all the villages by 2018-19, because there are just 4,000 villages still left to be electrified. So even after the grid reaches those villages, the ability of the system to supply reliable electricity for the better part of the day is limited. And we know that in the rural areas, in the best of places, the extent of electricity supply is not more than 14 to 15 hours. So decentralized solar power can provide the answer, provided it is backed by a reliable storage technology. And I can tell you that there is enough appetite in the villages for consuming electricity. It is only that because it's not available, therefore there is a lot of pent-up demand which has not come forward. But if we have to mainstream the villages into the development process, if we have to improve the quality of life in those far-flung areas, then energy would be required. Already around the urban areas, you find that there is a lot of purchasing power now available in villages, and their quality of life is improving, and the number of gadgets that they have which consume electricity is multiplying. So perhaps there would not be much difference in many of the localities within the city, so-called, and the adjacent rural areas which are classified as villages. So as far as the quality of life and the consumption of energy is concerned, I think there is a great deal of parity which is coming up, at least in the rural areas which are adjacent to urban areas. However, there are two other things I would like to emphasize, and then I'll stop. One is that, and this is not something to do directly with the subject that we are discussing today, but this has got to do with the distribution mechanism of electricity in India. So while this emphasis on installing greater capacity, we need to look at what is the market, what is the retail market in India for electricity, and how is it regulated. Today you find that in spite of the existence of a few private sector distribution companies, largely it is controlled by the state distribution utilities. And even when there are private distribution utilities, you don't have retail competition in the real sense, because somewhere there would be a distribution utility which belongs to the government, and somewhere there would be a distribution utility that belongs to the private sector. So how is it that you can create competition in retailing electricity in India? I think that is the next big step that will change the face of electricity market. And in that sense, I feel that solar rooftops, where you are a prosumer, literally, you are a producer and a consumer, that shows the way forward, that how people can consume electricity from the grid and yet produce a lot of electricity which they want. So I think that is one phase of solar power, which the decentralized phase of solar power, which is very important. The final thing that I want to say is that, you see, whatever new technology we adopt, and whatever the newer form of energy that we find, even if it is renewable, we cannot undermine the effort which is required and the attention that is required to be paid to energy conservation. So it cannot be anybody's case that because there is infinite solar energy, therefore I'll never switch off my lights. And the conservation aspect of energy, I think it needs to be emphasized more and more, because I think it is not a virtue which should come out of necessity, but it's a necessary virtue which we will have to inculcate and develop and follow if we respect the resources of nature. I am happy that in the Paris Agreement there was a renewed effort and a recognition that conservation of energy and changing the way we live, changing our habits which are energy consuming, that has been re-emphasized, and therefore I think lifestyle would play a greater part in restoring this balance between the prosperity and the progress that we seek and the harmony that is required if we have to progress in the real sense, the harmony with nature. So I think that is something, and I go back to the favorite story that I have on the pre-independence days when Gandhiji used to go from village to village, and he would also go to people to collect donations for the freedom struggle. So when he once went to one of the big businessmen, it was almost dusk when he went to his house, and he was made to sit in the room. The businessmen came, and as they were beginning to talk, there was a an attendant who came and he started lighting the lamp. And he got scolded by the businessman that on that evening he had consumed one matchstick more than what he would do every day. So Gandhiji became a little apprehensive and he said that if this guy is bothered about one matchstick, I cannot expect too much from him. But he was quite surprised when he gave him a very liberal donation, and then that person said that it's actually the habit of frugality which is important in life, because if I can meet my needs with that much resource, why should I try and use more resource than what is required? So I think that virtue of frugality, what in Hindustani used to be called kifayat, I don't even know if many people today know the meaning of kifayat. And I don't think that there is any exact equivalent of this word. Frugality is also not the correct equivalent. Because kifayat in itself contains the inherent respect that you have for resources. And it is not necessary for you to be poor to observe kifayat. So I think that is the kind of overall balance which will be required for us as we go forward. I must compliment ICRIER and the Stockholm Institute and all others who have been associated in this study. I hope this study provides workable models for the urban local bodies who have so far not been very actively involved in this kind of exercise, that they should become principal players, because ultimately they are the managers of urban living. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you, Mr. Lavasa, for those very insightful remarks. And I must say, I really liked the tone of your address, which I found to be upbeat, positive, and enthusiastic. Of course, it was balanced by the challenges we need to face and we need to address. But I think the general tone is very positive of Mr. Lavasa's address, and we share that enthusiasm with Mr. Lavasa. And also, I'm sure all of you who understood the word kifayat, Hindustani has this ability to be able to target things and features much more accurately than the English language, and I really like that word. And we'll keep that in mind as we progress. Are we going to, Greg, are you going to give an introduction to the report and then we launch it, or do we launch the report? So may I take this opportunity to also request Mr. Lavasa to launch our report, and then Greg will give an introduction and the team will then make the presentation. Mr. Lavasa, please. May I also request the team to come up on the stage?
Thank you so much, Mr. State Secretary Lavasa. Thank you so much for all of you coming here today. We are a little bit over time by now, but we have plenty of time to make up for things, so we don't have to rush anything. Just as two words that might not directly correlate to the report's content itself, just a personal, I have to say that this work was, for me personally, very inspiring. It's very inspiring what is happening in India. And I think nowadays in Europe particularly, we are very concerned about development and how it is not going forward the way we want to. And I think India is the source, I think, or can be the source of inspiration for many developing countries or still in development countries, particularly in Asia and in Africa. And I think as a European, I think this has been one of the greater mistakes from our side. So we think that we would be able to inform based from our viewpoint. I think India has much to give to the world when it comes to development, and in particular then to solar energy. So this report is been the brainchild, I should say, of 3 organizations. So this is, of course, ICRIER, and you're all familiar with ICRIER, the Climate Policy Institute and Initiative, sorry, and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And we met around 9 months ago and worked out, we wanted to work on a project that we thought would address an issue that nobody else has addressed and looked into, which is rooftop solar and how we finance it. And we looked particularly then on municipal bonds. So we already are familiar with India's very ambitious renewable energy goal. And I think when it was launched 3 or 4 years ago, it was considered basically inachievable, even by the most optimistic observers. And the progress that, of course, we have seen in the last just 2 years, and I have to end with this, just in 2 years, we've seen an enormous progress on this target. So we today have, by the end of last year, we had 50 gigawatts of renewable energy installed. And since then, I think April was 5.745 gigawatts, and I think it's additional. And I think now we're at around 6 gigawatts. So this is a sector that's rapidly developing. And if there's one lesson I want you to take away from this is the prices, the capacities, the technologies are changing at a rapid pace that no one was able to even conceive in the last 3-4 years ago. So I want you to, if you are a project manager and you are a local government, or you are a banker, you're looking into this, check the prices every quarter, because I can promise you what we're seeing right now, they go down 7-8%, and I'm talking equipment, I'm talking feed-in tariffs, and so on. So that's just as a caveat before we go into this, and that's of course has been led to the fact that we had a tender now in May, where for the first time utility scale solar then was below coal. So solar is now out-competing coal on price, on levelized costs of electricity. The state of rooftop solar. So within these very ambitious goals, 40 gigawatts of rooftop solar is targeted for 2022. And we have now seen an increase of capacity from 2013 to around the end of last year, from a meager 170 megawatts to a proper 1.25 gigawatts. To put this in perspective, just globally, the market leader in this field is Germany, and it has around 27 gigawatts installed. Just to kind of see what the potential is, what we also see is that, of course, that most of rooftop solar projects in India right now are capex based, meaning that a rooftop owner is fronting the cost of the solar panels, of the inverters, etc. And that's, of course, very interesting. But we believe that, and this is not just us, but also other organizations that are active in this field in India, we believe that more needs to be done in OPEX, which would, of course, then reduce the capital costs for those who wish to have rooftop solar installed. The pie chart here, which you can see on page 12 in the report, gives you our estimate of the sector-wise distribution of the remaining 38.75 gigawatts of rooftop solar capacity needed by 2022. And you can see that the industrial and commercial sector are standing for the majority of that capacity, around 29 gigawatts. Residential and public buildings make up somewhere between 9 and 10. I think it's 9.5. So we need a lot of work on the commercial and industrial sector. So as I already said, and it's already been mentioned here before, what you see here is our estimate of the levelized cost of electricity from rooftop solar. That's the blue line, and it's around 5.79 rupees per kilowatt hour. However, I know that the team, and there was the CPIs, where they have mentioned to me that they're already aware of developers that do this below 5. So again, these numbers are for around the beginning of this year, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this is going down as we speak, as scale goes up, as developers get more proficient, as commercial and financiers are getting more, say, confident with it. But what you see here is, and this is then we listed a number of states here, and we listed a number of tariffs quoted for the commercial, the industrial, residential, and public sector. We see that the level of cost of electricity from rooftop solar is already competing or beating tariffs almost everywhere and in almost all sectors. So that's also, I think, that's probably surprising a lot, but this is what the level of cost of electricity looks like at the moment. However, of course, we have a barrier here, and the barrier is, of course, the high upfront costs. As with any new electricity generation capacity, you need to pay for it. So this is not necessarily an issue just for rooftop solar, considering that, if you want to buy a new coal power plant, and I know that plans to build new coal power plants are very difficult in India right now, but banks are not particularly confident in them. So upfront capex costs are always an issue, of course, when they remain a barrier for rooftop solar, and particularly adoption in residential and the public sector. And one of the key reasons that we found is the limited access to cheap debt capital for rooftop solar developers. And this is important for developers. So this is because banks still perceiving the risk for giving out a loan for rooftop solar developers is comparatively high. We have a higher cost of debt, and we do not have enough scale, really, to lower the price for debt capital. So this results then in the fact that we have the capex model still is the majority force of rooftop solar financing in India. I will now hand over the word to my dear colleague Amita from ICRIER, who will tell a bit more on how we try to develop targets for rooftop solar development, and also how we dealt with our 2 case studies.
Moving on, so we already know that targets are ambitious, and based on the current installed figures, if you're talking about moving up to 40 gigawatt, there's a 32-fold increase that needs to happen within the next 5 years. And if we unbox it a little, and if we have the sector-wise composition, so then for commercial and industrial sectors, we'll need an increase to 29.2 gigawatt, and an increase of 21 times for the residential and public sector buildings, till 9.5 gigawatts. So this is a big ask, and during the course of the presentation, as well as if you go through the report, we discuss about how this can come about. If we ask the question about how much would it cost to the economy, so the figure here that you see, so here we've costed out the private costs. So different sectors, individual entities, if they were to install rooftop solar, how much would it cost? So we get a figure of 1.8 trillion in Indian rupees, and if we cost it out in USD dollar terms, it comes to around 28 USD billion. Note that this is private costs. If you add the subsidies that were given and add it to calculate the total economic costs, this number jumps up to 39 billion. Now we're talking about the rooftop solar context in India. So from, say, rooftop solar till now has been largely an urban issue. So be it from one of the largest policies that is geared towards rooftop solar, that is the Solar Cities program. Even if you look at numbers for current installations, which are largely in the urban sector because of capacities to pay, because of built-up space, because of, say, the economic reasons which motivate people to go for rooftop solar. So it's been largely an urban phenomena. But to happen, to scale it up further, what would it take? So we have a checklist of 4 suggestions that we give. So this is a recurring theme, so these 4 will flow through the rest of the presentation as well, but it's good to just look at them in total. What are we trying to say? So the first thing that we want to actually delve a bit into would be that devolution of targets are needed. So solar cities have, as part of their solar master plans, given some numbers, but do they at all add up to what is the ask for states as a whole? For example, in my presentation that will follow a few slides down, we look at the case of Gujarat. So Gujarat has a target of 3.2 gigawatt. So would the 3 solar cities of Rajkot, Surat, and Gandhinagar add up to that 3.2, and is more needed? So Mr. Ashok Lavasa's presentation, he talked about how maybe the peri-urban areas or rural areas that could be looked at. Alternatively, how can the scale, just urban rooftop scale, be increased? So we'll talk about that. Second point is you need to find new ways of raising debt capital. My colleague from CPI, Saurabh, will be talking more about this. The third point here is forging greater partnerships between local governments, developers, and customers. So we believe, in fact, as you read the report, you'll also understand, is that because municipal governments are the closest to the governed and understand the fact that installing rooftop systems is a decentralized decision. So if I, as a rooftop owner, want to go for a rooftop solar sort of system, I have to be independently persuaded. So that's why municipal government, since it's close to me, so that sort of persuasion happens easier. Then the fourth point that we want to talk about is different policy measures that would empower city governments to take a lead. So this question would always come, why municipal governments? Why not somebody else? So this is something that we're going to talk through and also mentioned as part of the report. We follow a case study approach. So Dr. Kathuria in his address has already talked about the 2 case studies that we looked at. So how we selected the 2 is also important to mention. So we specifically selected cities that had both, were part of the Solar Cities program, because then you get a master plan on what is the technical potential that the cities themselves report, as well as the cities got additional brownie points if they were a smart city as well, because they have prior experience of working on an SPV sort of system. Then the second grouping that we had was for renewable energy potential. So what is the potential? What is the economics behind it? So the city, if you have a good and a healthy DISCOM system, or if you had high cost of power purchase, would be persuaded easier into going for rooftop solar. The third set of factors are readiness for municipal bonds. So essentially, if a municipal government is strong financially, it has a high credit rating, it has a very responsive governance systems, and if it has had past experience in municipal bonds, it was ranked higher. So based on all these criteria, we selected Surat as well as NDMC to be our case study cities. Moving on, devolution of capacity targets. So this was an important piece of research that we did. So in fact, if all of you have a copy of the report in your hands now, if you look at Annexure 3, this is what I'm going to talk about. So what exactly we talked about is the fact that, again, taking the example of Gujarat, sorry, same example repeated, but we tried to do a top-down analysis. So for example, Gujarat has a total of 3.2 gigawatt that it needs to achieve by 2022. How would it do it? So we devolved the targets from 3.2 to different lakh plus cities. So just a caveat that I would want to mention about the analysis is first, is that we are assuming that most of the rooftop solar would be largely urban. Second assumption is that we assume that lakh plus, so that is 100,000, cities having 100,000 plus population or million plus populations will be the cities where it's going to happen, because they possibly have the wherewithal to actually go in for rooftop solar systems. So using that, so for Gujarat, we found 29 cities to actually meet this criteria, and we devolved the target of 3.2 gigawatt to how much is the ask per city. And you can see the criteria outlined, so I won't go through it. But basically, we had economic factors, technical factors, which is from built-up area, household, discoms, as well as social acceptance. So is a city rooted in its old ways, or does it want to innovate and go for new technologies? So those were factors that we looked at. And using this, we devolved targets. Furthermore, we also looked at it from a scenario point of view. So there's a large fan. So we have 3 scenarios. So scenario 1 is one of least sort of ambition. So what are we talking about? So here we are talking about just what cities themselves report. So we have found that cities have a tendency to underreport what they can achieve. So that is the least. So that is scenario 1, the least ambitious scenario. And then moving on to scenario 2 and 3. 2 and 3 is what the cities can achieve, or at least are expected to achieve if they have to match up to what the state totals are. So 3.2 for Gujarat, and for Delhi a total of 1.1 gigawatt. Sorry, I'm throwing up a lot of numbers here, but I'll just walk you through what we're going to talk about. So there are 2 key messages that need to be understood from this slide. So first, if you look at the capacity in megawatt terms. So just see, so for example, note that these scenario numbers for scenario 1 is what the city themselves have reported minus what is already installed. So this is what the cities need to do. So for Surat, if we have, say, 412 megawatt is what the city themselves reported. But if we devolve targets, we get to a total of 726.9. So obviously the installation requirement, the cost of installation increases. So so we've costed both scenarios out. So if you look at the total, so the row above that, so we are actually costing out how much would it cost to the city. So for Surat, it's 1785 crores, while it moves up to the highest amount is 3305.9. In a similar nature, if you look at the NDMC numbers, it goes up many folds. So from 5.7, so you have a target of 7.2 minus already installed. So you have 5.7 megawatt capacity that you need to achieve. If you were to devolve targets, it will move up to 109.7. So I'll just, so this is a methodology that we've only done for these 2 cities, but we hope that in maybe a forthcoming paper, we'll do it for other major cities around the country to get a sense of what more needs to be done. So that, I think, is a gap in policy space that needs to be filled. Anyways, but moving on, you can see how the investment amounts also increase. And the second key message that I would want to draw attention to would be the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3. If I go to the previous slide, scenario 2 is where the sectoral shares come from the Solar Cities program themselves. So what it essentially means is what cities see as feasible. So for example, for cities to target their own public buildings, for cities to target residential spaces, it would be easier. So those numbers, the breakups reflect that. But the scenario 3, you talk about distribution based on energy consumption. So I could argue, or the team could argue, that this is where it's at. So the people who are consuming the most are the ones who can be persuaded easier because you're already consuming a high amount. So you have this sort of breakup. So just see the sectoral difference. So for example, for Surat, it is 1223.5 crores. But if the breakup changes and you move to scenario 3, where it's based on actual energy consumption, you have the industrial sector, which suddenly goes up. And just take note of the fact that the policy or the incentive structures for residential spaces and industrial and commercial entities are totally different. So the sort of policy package that would be required for them to scale up would be totally different. So that needs to be taken into account. Okay, I'll now hand over the presentation to Saurabh.
Thank you, Amrita. Before I start my presentation, I would also like to thank my contributing author, Lavanya. Okay, so just to summarize here, we already discussed that there's a huge investment gap in the rooftop sector, which is around $28 billion if we exclude the subsidy, and around $39 billion if you include everything, to reach the required target. And the key barriers that we are seeing in this sector are already discussed, are the limited avenues of raising debt capital, raising it at an affordable cost. And the issue that this debt capital is facing is that there's not enough scale at the rooftop developer level. So these three barriers are what we are trying to address in the proposed solution. And I just want to say that whatever we are proposing, we want to take the reaction from the audience actually, because this is something very radical or innovative approach that we are trying to propose. And I bothered many times Ms. Geetali on this and got a lot of reaction from her during the course of the study. So the solution that we are proposing here, that why not municipal bond can be used for removing these three barriers that are existing in the sector. This is just to give a brief of this model that we are trying to propose here. It's a public-private partnership approach, which is very similar to DBFO model, design, build, finance, and operate. But slight variation in this. All these, in the typical DBFO investment model, all these activities are being taken care by the private entities. But here what we are suggesting that since the private entity in this case is not capable enough and facing a lot of challenges in financing, why not public entity like municipal corporations come in front and try to solve this issue. And what we are saying essentially here, that why not municipal entity can play a role of finance aggregator for the developers, especially who are operating in the RESCO model. So some of the rationales have already been discussed, like why it makes sense for municipal bonds and municipal corporations to engage in this sector. Now, these are some of the rationales that I also like to highlight, which are from the perspective of the rooftop sector as per se. We are saying that municipal corporations are better suited to access the capital markets if we compare it with the small rooftop developers. What we mean by saying this is that they have the financial strength or the balance sheet size through which they can leverage and go into the capital market to raise the required bonds or the debt capital. Second point is on the creditworthiness. If you compare with the small rooftop developers, they are not credit rated, most of them. And if you see municipal corporations and like NDMC and also the Pune, they have got AA+ of rating, and even Ahmedabad and Surat. And they also can leverage the state government guarantee. Although we are not proposing it to leverage, but they have that cushion. If they want to, they can, if they need it in some course, then they can leverage that. Third point that we are trying to make here is that municipal corporations have this cushion of internal revenue, revenue from the other sources, which if required can be used, and it has been used in previous municipal bond issuance. That will also provide a lot of comfort to the investors. And the fourth point is that it can actually lead to the aggregation of the rooftop solar projects at a developer level. What we mean by aggregation is that right now what is happening, whenever a rooftop developer goes to a bank at an individual level, it doesn't have the scale, and the transaction cost per unit of the project cost is very high for the developer, and the bank is not entertaining the developers. So if the developer is seeing, okay, there is a pool of capital, the municipalities can help them. Or the thing is, the condition is that you have to come together, at least at the city level, and then you are able to get this mode of financing. So that will bring a lot of developers aggregated, at least on the city level. Okay, this is the transaction structure. This is one of the transaction structure that we have focused in our study. So if you see the middle block, which is the in the left side, which is a corporate municipal entity, SEBI has given a lot of guidelines how to form this, and we are calling it a CME or the master SPV in this case. This SPV will be responsible for raising the bonds in the market, and it will enter into the capital lease mechanism with the project SPVs. And then project SPVs, solar asset will be transferred to these project SPVs in the form of capital lease arrangement, and to provide the comfort to the CME and also some kind of cushion to the investor as well. We are suggesting that there should be some kind of advance payment or some kind of security fee that has to be given to the CME upfront. Then the rest of the model is very similar to the RESCO model, where the project SPV, after getting the debt capital from the CME, they will sign PPAs with their respective consumers. And then the slight variation that we are trying to show here is that there will be an escrow account, so that the PPA payments are hold into that escrow account, and so and the CME will be able to take out this lease payments from that escrow account, and rest of the payments will from the PPA payments will go to the project SPVs. So we also try to see